Hi, my name is Carlos Cuesta. I'm a student of foreign languages from the Colombiana University, and today I have the pleasure to share with you a short but substantial analysis about the book 1984, written by George Orwell. This analysis is intended to encourage you to read this amazing book. But first of all, let me tell you how I will pose this analysis. Based on the triad approach, which comprises three specific frameworks, I will develop each one according to a pre-established and coherent order. To begin with the contextual framework, in which the analysis will describe not only situational elements but other aspects like historical and contextual aspects of the epoch, and of course, a short presentation of the author. Subsequently, I will focus my attention on the development of the semantic framework, in which the analysis will be based on my own interpretation of the masterpiece, the themes I consider as relevant, and some commentators' opinions. Likewise, I will pose some implicit innuendos introduced by the author. Finally, in the linguistic framework, I will cite details some figure of speech stated in the novel so as to support my own interpretation of the masterpiece. At the end, having developed the three previous frameworks, I will present my conclusion and a question upon the novel. Contextual framework. Eric Arthur Blair, most known by his pen name George Orwell, was born in 1903. He was an English novelist, essayist, and critic. He created some of the sharpest satirical fiction of the 20th century, with such works as Animal Farm in 1945 and 1984 in 1949. He was a man of strong opinions who addressed some of the major political movements of his times, including imperialism, fascism, and communism. The British Newsweekly, The Economist in 2008 declared perhaps the 20th century's best chronicler of English culture. In the essay Why I Write in 1946, he said that since 1936 he had been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. Germ. Let's talk about the germ. 1984 is a dystopian or fictional novel. This means that it's an imaginary community or society that is undesirable or frightening. School of thought. George Orwell belonged to the socialist movement. His work is marked by lucid prose, awareness of social injustice, opposition to totalitarianism, and commitment to democratic socialism. Literary movement. George Orwell wrote in the modernist time period, and in 1984 was written down, especially in the post-war period. This was after the World War II. This is a literary and art movement which sprang up at the start of the 20th century during World War I and the Russian Revolution, but it keeps from that time, from the World War I and World War II. Historical context. This time was characterized by growing tension and unease with social disorder and unrest. This refers directly to back to World War One and World War Two, the Spanish Civil War, and the rise of communism, a period in history which is marred by unspeakable horrors and devastating wars. Not only authors like George Orwell, through his novel 1984, reflected this social unrest and degradation of their works, but also painters. Semantic framework. In this framework, I want to highlight which I consider the two most relevant themes in the novel 1984. The first one is people freedom. From the beginning and during the novel, we can evidence many situations in which people are not permitted to think freely. On the contrary, they are forced to think and do what the big brother, which in this case is like an entity or a character, I really didn't know who was or what was that. However, there were propaganda everywhere. The most tenebrous propaganda was about a picture with an enormous face of a military man who gazed from from almost all the walls that were in that devastated place. Beneath of that picture there were a phrase written in capital letter that said, "Big Brother is watching you." So this was a psychological and mental instrument to make people follow absolutely all the rules, all the rules. Otherwise, there were phrases like war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and many other instruments they used in order for the people to be subjugated and manipulated. In second place, another important issue is totalitarianism, in which there is an abusive nature of authoritarian government that monitors people's actions and thinking through many telescreens. We could evidence that in the novel, and infiltrated agents from the top police. This is further evidence of the psychology of power and the ways that manipulations of language and history can be used as mechanism of control. The newspeak is a clear example of those mechanisms of controlling people to express less their thoughts. In this sense, I want to introduce a comment from the book on 1984, Orwell and Our Future. This book, which was edited by Abbott Glanson, claims that literary author has no obligation to track the truth while writing fiction. They refer to the fact that George Orwell tended to conserve people for the factual veracity and apparent predictions. However, in the page 35 of the novel, George Orwell, through the protagonist's wisdom, when he started to write his diary, he wrote the next paragraph, and we could understand to whom was addressed that diary or this novel in this case. And it says, to the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. In doing so, and taking into consideration that it is a fictional dystopian novel, we cannot reassure that what George Orwell wrote in the novel is a prophecy. However, mark this, in his book Big Brother, The Orwellian Nightmare Come True, he states that technology that now exists or is under development and will exist in the near future that threatens to make our world just as horrific or even worse than the world George Orwell described. Linguistic framework. Without doubt, in this novel, we can find countless figures of speech. However, I'm just going to name two. The first one is the figure of speech called opposition, which is the placing of two statements that complement each other. In page 44, this figure of speech comes out from the term doublethink. To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. On the other hand, is the figure of speech called elision, which is when the speech is omitted one or more than two letters, and this occurs in the page 173. It was only a hopeless fancy. In this case, hopeless goes without age. So in that way, we can evidence the elision. My conclusion. Although we can say that the film 1984 is a dystopian and fictional novel, our reality is not far from it. Nowadays there is a big brother watching us through the countless of cameras everywhere on the streets. This fact enables Big Brother to know who thinks different from its ideology. Governments use technology to spy not only ordinary people but to spy governments each other. This with the aim of having total power in the world. Finally, I want you to ask yourself to what extent the novel 1984 is a dystopian reality compared with the facts we are living currently in our world.